Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 5 waiver wire targets for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about waiver wire targets at the running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, kicker, and defensive positions going into Week 5. Players who some of them benefited from the fact that their teammates got injured in Week 4, while others are benefiting from the fact that they had breakout performances and are going to hopefully continue as such going forward in order to help us in our Week 5 matchups and beyond. We'll talk about these players. Before we do so, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season with the singular purpose of trying to help you win a 2022 fantasy football championship. We are very close to surpassing our goal of 70,000 subscribers, so if you have not yet already, be sure to help us get to that. Click the subscribe button today. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about, first and foremost, the running back position, and the biggest news as of this morning: Javonte Williams tearing his ACL and having a season-ending injury. Now, who steps up in his place? Of course, we do anticipate that Melvin Gordon is going to be the front runner in that backfield, but based on his utilization yesterday, the fact that he only, really had 9 snaps within that offense after he fumbled was rendered completely a backup at that point. But going forward, we saw a lot of Mike Boone, and that's why I wanted to go ahead and talk about him as this week's #1 waiver wire pickup at the running back position. Mike Boone has already gone ahead and played for the Minnesota Vikings a couple years back and has been with the Denver Broncos over the last 2 seasons. Now, for many of us, we do remember Mike Boone a couple years ago when Dalvin Cook and had a couple of his injuries, and Alexander Mattison was also out for some period of time with the Minnesota Vikings. We had Mike Boone in a couple championship games. For those of you who are familiar with the name, that's probably where you remember him from. But outside of that, is relatively new to the fantasy community because he hasn't really been that valuable considering he's always been a backup option / handcuff. But in this current circumstance, considering there was Melvin Gordon and Javonte in this backfield, we really didn't need to address Mike Boone until now. With that all mentioned, he is currently only rostered in 0% of Yahoo leagues. That makes him 100% available to all of you to go out and pick up this week who have the #1 waiver priority. And as of this current moment, of all the available options going into Week 5, he has the most potential for upside. This is most likely going to be a committee situation rest of season. I'm not saying that Mike Boone is going to out-snap Melvin Gordon on a weekly basis or even out-touch him, but there's a possibility. Let's not forget, Melvin Gordon was dealing with a neck injury prior to going into that game against the Las Vegas Raiders, and once he fumbled, they didn't really play him much. Maybe that was a matter of his fumble, or maybe that was a matter of his injury potentially flaring up, which may have made it a little bit more difficult for him to play the rest of that contest against the Raiders. Either way, they have a short week. They take on the Indianapolis Colts on Thursday Night Football. If in fact you have the ability to do so, and you have a top waiver priority, Mike Boone is the option that we're going for. Unfortunately, for those of you who had Javonte Williams, his season is over, and we'll go ahead and hope that he makes a speedy recovery for next year so he can help our fantasy teams. Moving on, let's talk about our #2 option. It is Brian Robinson Jr. He has been medically cleared for Week 5, and that was the expectation that he was going to come off the injured reserve. He is currently rostered in 54% of leagues. Typically, when I go throughout our weekly waiver wire video, I want to talk about players that are rostered in less than 50% of leagues, but I thought it was just another reminder for half the leagues that are out there that don't have him on roster already. You want to make sure you go ahead and pick him up. Antonio Gibson and J.D. McKissic are obviously still in that backfield. Antonio Gibson played 41% of the snaps this past Sunday. There may be an opportunity for Brian Robinson to jump into this offense and take primary first and second down running back work out of this backfield, if not also get third down opportunities, because we have seen from his days at Alabama, he's a rookie of course, that he is a capable receiving threat. As of this current moment in time, this is an offense that has been throwing the ball a lot, as they haven't been able to protect Carson Wentz much, and they haven't been very effective in the running game. Maybe Brian Robinson will be able to apply more opportunity in terms of being a pass blocker on third downs and also have more of an effective running game going forward. They take on Tennessee this upcoming week. It may be considered a difficult matchup, but we'll talk about that tomorrow when we talk about matchups via the running back position with our weekly running back rankings video. All right, let's go ahead and let's move on to the next option I wanted to mention. It is Tyler Allgeier, rookie running back of the Atlanta Falcons. Earlier today, prior to this video, Cordero Patterson was placed on the injured reserve, which presents a lot of value for Tyler Allgeier going forward, but it does mean that Cordero Patterson is eventually going to return from his current knee injury. We mentioned Tyler Allgeier last week in this exact same, conversation. We want to have Tyler Allgeier on roster as a pure handcuff, because if something is to happen to Cordero Patterson, there's a lot of value to be had in a run-first offense like the Atlanta Falcons have had. Now, Cordero Patterson is going to be out, and Tyler Allgeier, along with potentially Damian Williams and or Caleb Huntley, are going to be the rotation of backs. But based on his performance 10 carries, 84 rushing yards, 1 catch for 20 receiving yards against the Cleveland Browns this past Sunday was great. And he's currently only rostered in 16% of leagues. If we're going to be in a situation where this team's going to continue to run the ball as heavily as they have, of course, we anticipate Tyler Allgeier to have value. Unfortunately, they do take on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this upcoming week, which is a difficult matchup. But nonetheless, having this kind of starter value for the weeks ahead, certainly something that we want to address and have on roster. That is why we're going after Tyler Allgeier. Moving on, we have Raheem Mostert as our number 4. He is currently rostered in 50% of leagues on Yahoo flat. With Tua out, and he's already been designated out for week 5, there is a lot of potential that this team is going to continue to run the ball. And though Chase Edmonds is currently the red zone specialist out of this team, that's pretty much where he lies within that offense. The running back, quote unquote, the rushing attempts are going in the direction of Raheem Mostert, having 15 carries for 69 rushing yards, 3 targets, 2 catches, 12 receiving yards this past week on Thursday Night Football against the Cincinnati Bengals defense, who they themselves are a pretty good run-stopping defense. Nonetheless, Raheem Mostert found himself a lot of success. They take on the New York Jets this upcoming week. I think it's a favorable matchup, and if in fact you are in need of a running back because maybe you are dealing with DeVante Williams' injury and you're not going to be able to recover with Mike Boone, Tyler Allgeier, Raheem Mostert, another one of these players that you should be picking up and potentially utilizing for the weeks ahead. Moving on to Rachaad White. Rachaad White had himself a relatively good game last night on Sunday Night Football, and though that was a one-sided matchup, it did present a lot of value for garbage time Tom Brady points with the receiving threats of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Of course, we saw Leonard Fournette get involved. Of course, Rachaad White got a little bit of utilization, but neither of those two running backs found themselves any sort of utilization in the running game. In fact, Leonard Fournette finished with negative rushing yards, and Rachaad White himself, 3 attempts for 6 rushing yards. Besides the fact that he fumbled on the first kick return of the game, he had himself a relatively good fantasy week. 5 catches on 5 targets, 50 receiving yards, and a rushing touchdown on the goal line. There was a singular drive late in the third quarter in which, of course, we saw Tom Brady and Rachaad White be in that backfield the entire time. Leonard Fournette wasn't involved in that drive because it was pretty much a game in which they were trying to run a 2-minute drill down the field. And of course, they utilized Rachaad White as a receiving back, so they gave him a little bit of a rep there. Looked pretty good. They take on Atlanta this week. I don't put it past the potential of this team to go back to 100% using Leonard Fournette, but I do want to mention the fact that Rachaad White is a pure handcuff. 26% rostered, should look to potentially add him because not only does he have the potential of third down back value going forward, but if anything happens to Leonard Fournette, a lot of value there. Moving on to Latavius Murray, our number 6. Now, Latavius Murray is probably going back to the practice squad, but I do want to mention, if there is a potential in which a trade happens and somebody comes in and takes Latavius Murray away from the New Orleans Saints, don't be surprised. Latavius Murray looked good. The guy was averaging over 5 yards per carry against the Minnesota Vikings defense. And right now, he's only rostered in 1% of leagues. This is a player that I just want to mention just in case, if in fact he is still active and Alvin Kamara is going to miss time. There's a lot of value to be had playing up against the Seattle Seahawks defense this upcoming week. Again, Latavius Murray's coming off of a week where he scored 13 fantasy points. Had himself a rushing touchdown, got himself some utilization in the receiving game out of his backfield, and purely did look really good. He's looked a lot better than a lot of other running backs in the National Football League in terms of his burst, his ability to make contact and get yards even after said contact. Either way, just kind of putting it out there for those of you who play in super deep leagues or are potentially looking to try to handcuff the opportunity of Alvin Kamara, considering Latavius Murray looks like he may be the next up back in this backfield outside of Mark Ingram, who may be on the way out in terms of opportunities if Alvin Kamara is going to miss time. All right, let's move on to the wide receiver conversation, beginning with Isaiah McKenzie. I know Isaiah McKenzie left the game against the Baltimore Ravens with a head injury. The assumption is that it is a concussion, but if in fact he is able to play, there's a lot of opportunity on the table. Jamison Crowder, the only other slot receiver in this offense, broken ankle. So considering the fact that Isaiah McKenzie has scored a receiving touchdown in 3 out of the last 4 games, and this team is going on their way to potentially getting him more utilization, fading out Gabriel Davis within his receiving game, there may be a lot of opportunity coming down the line for Isaiah McKenzie. He's currently only rostered in 47% of leagues, and if he's going to play even more snaps, get more opportunities in terms of targets, by all means, Isaiah McKenzie has a lot of fantasy upside going forward, and that is why he is the number 1 wide receiver I wanted to mention. Moving on to number 2, it is George Pickens, the rookie wide receiver. George Pickens obviously is going to benefit from the fact that Mitchell Trubisky is now being transitioned to Kenny Pickett. Now, on yesterday's live stream Sunday morning, somebody had sent in a message and said, "Hey, Andrew, I have a good feeling about George Pickens." And I was like, you know what? So do I. There is something in the air that feels like a rookie breakout was going to happen. We talked about it. I told that guy, hey, you know what? Roll with, George Pickens. And by all means, he had himself a pretty good game. 6 catches on 8 targets, 102 receiving yards. Not all of it was done with Pickett. Majority of those receptions, in fact, were with Mitchell Trubisky, considering how long Trubisky was in the game for. But nonetheless, this is going to be an offense that's going to have to throw the ball a bunch. In the next couple weeks, they have some relatively difficult matchups. And if the rookie quarterback is going to have to stand out, sit in the pocket, and make some plays, he's going to have to get a lot of help from his receiving threats. Deontay Johnson, Claypool, and especially George Pickens, the rookie wide receiver, who in the last 2 weeks has looked fantastic. Currently only rostered in 39% of leagues. Go ahead, go after him. Moving on, we're talking about Michael Gallup. Now, for those of you who already stashed Michael Gallup and have been waiting for his potential return, of course, you were benefiting from the fact that he had himself a receiving touchdown this last weekend. 2 receptions on 3 targets, 24 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown. He only played 64% of the offensive snaps, but they're going to get him slowly but surely kind of transition into this offense. If Dak Prescott is going to make himself a return here, there's a lot of value to be had. Again, this is a wide receiver who's currently only rostered in 41% of leagues. Maybe he's already rostered in your league, which he should be. But if he is not, another one of these wide receivers who's going to get a lot of opportunity within this Dallas Cowboys offense, who is going to have to throw the ball a bunch. They play against the Rams this upcoming week. If Dak is back and Gallup is ready, there could be a great matchup here and a great overall fantasy product at the end of the week. Moving on, we're talking about our number 4, Josh Reynolds. Josh Reynolds had himself an amazing week, had himself 17.6 fantasy points, despite the fact that there was no Amon-Ra St. Brown, DJ Chark, or DeAndre Swift. The Detroit Lions offense managed to score 45 points and still lose. Of course, TJ Hawkinson had himself an all-time week. But outside of that, Josh Reynolds playing 84% of the snaps, 7 catches, 81 yards, and a touchdown. We talked about this in terms of the must-start players, a guy that already had a built-in rapport with Jared Goff, considering they played together with the Los Angeles Rams. We even saw this report late last season when Josh Reynolds was signed to the Detroit Lions and brought in. He immediately made an impact, and hopefully going forward, he's going to continue to be a threat within this offense. Jared Goff looks incredible. We'll talk about him a little bit later, but as of right now, within an offense who's going to continue to have to score a bunch every single week in order to keep up with the fact that their defense cannot stop a soul, I believe Josh Reynolds, with a current 20% rostership, should be available and maybe a pickup option. Moving on to Corey Davis. Now, the entire question revolving the New York Jets offense was who exactly is Zach Wilson going to prefer as his number 1 receiving target? And that was apparent considering the fact that Corey Davis led the receiving core and even running backs, tight ends in terms of total targets on Sunday against the Pittsburgh Steelers. 7 targets, 5 catches, 74 yards, and a receiving touchdown. 15.9 half PPR fantasy points. They take on the Miami Dolphins this upcoming weekend. Based on the target counts that we saw from Breece Hall, who had 6, and Garrett Wilson, who had 6, Tyler Conklin had 5 targets, there's going to be a spread offense here that is going to utilize a lot of threats. But going forward, if Corey Davis is going to be a player that is going to get a lot of snaps, playing 74% just this past weekend, currently rostered in only 24% of leagues, could be an option going forward that is the number 1 wide receiver threat for this team. Very possible. Moving on, DeVante Parker is the final player I wanted to mention. Of course, we do have a conversation in regards to if Jakobi Meyers returns, he could very easily go back to being the number 1 receiving option of this offense, considering, he was exactly that prior to his injury. Meyers, who's only rostered in 43% of leagues, not a bad option. But as of right now, DeVante Parker, he is only rostered in 28% of leagues. Played 97% of the offensive snaps, scored himself a touchdown, had himself 2 relevant fantasy weeks back-to-back. If we're going to see Mac Jones return, of course, I do anticipate to see DeVante Parker get a lot of utilization. They take on the Detroit Lions. We just saw Tyler Lockett. We just saw Rashad Penny. We just saw DK Metcalf destroy that defense and put up a bunch of fantasy points. Even Will Disley had himself a day. Either way, DeVante Parker, not a bad option, even with Zappy, the 3rd-string rookie, quarterback. There could be value to be had in the upcoming weeks. The only other 2 honorable mentions I want to mention in regards to the wide receiver position, Alec Pierce, taking on Denver on Thursday, could be an option, had himself 10 fantasy points, and as well, Nico Collins for the Houston Texans. They take on the Jacksonville Jaguars, could be another option that you want to look at in a deeper league. Both those guys currently rostered in only 5% and 21% of leagues, for those of you interested. Moving on to the tight end position, let's begin with the New York Jet, Tyler Conklin. At this current moment, Tyler Conklin at the tight end position has less receptions than only Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, and Zach Ertz. Outside of those 3 other tight end options, Tyler Conklin has more receptions at the tight end position than any other tight end prospect, which is incredible. He takes on the Miami Dolphins this upcoming week in an extremely advantageous matchup, in a game in which, of course, we should see a competitive bout between these 2 teams. If Tyler Conklin's going to continue to play 80+% of the snaps every single week and continue to see a fair share of targets, going in his direction. He'll always be a red zone threat. And I'm anticipating Tyler Conklin, who's only rostered in 42% of leagues, to continue to be a relevant fantasy option at the tight end position for those of you who are in need. Moving on to Will Dissly. Now, speaking of, we did mention him a little bit ago, but Will Dissly, in 3 out of the last 4 weeks, has been a top 7 fantasy tight end. And yet he's only rostered in 3% of leagues. And I understand the touchdown dependency is the biggest difference maker. But hey, if the Seattle Seahawks are going to continue to utilize him in that format, I mean, even Noah Fant scored a touchdown in the receiving game this past weekend against the Detroit Lions. But if Geno Smith prefers to throw Will Dissly the ball down in the red zone, why are we ignoring it? We have to go ahead and take advantage of this, because if we're going to potentially have a tight end that is going to be scoring touchdowns, is going to be in that top 10 conversation or top 7 conversation, half PPR every single week, why not go ahead, have him on roster? You don't have to play him this upcoming week against the New Orleans Saints, but if it's something that you need to do, considering you don't have much else depth at the tight end position, could be a pretty decent option. Moving on to Hayden Hurst. Now, the other tight end within this roster who is primarily the number 2 is Drew Sample. He has been placed on the injured reserve. Going forward, if we're going to see an opportunity for Hayden Hurst to see even more opportunities in terms of snap counts and even targets, these numbers are going to look great for him. He only played 56% of the offensive snaps this past weekend. Of course, they saw a rotation at the tight end position, but if those numbers continue to crawl in the positive direction, a player who's only rostered in 21% of leagues, he could make a statement game here against the Baltimore Ravens. Let's not forget last year, 2021, the 2 games the Bengals took on the Ravens, they scored 41 points in each of those games. So in 2 games, 82 total points against that defense. A lot of potential here for a high-scoring matchup between these two teams within the AFC North. Moving on to Robert Tonyan. Now, Robert Tonyan had himself a good week. Had himself a total of 8.5 fantasy points. We'll take that at the tight end position. But unfortunately, only 1 target, 1 reception, and 20 receiving yards. That in itself is not enough to justify Robert Tonyan being a weekly starter, because we really do need him to get a lot more utilization in terms of the receiving game, because we cannot guarantee that this man is going to be the number 1 red zone receiving threat of this offense in comparison to a couple years ago. So with that said, yes, he does have value. He could get more opportunity. They take on the New York Giants this upcoming week in London. But Robert Tonyan, one of those options that, yes, he's available, but he is a lesser potential opportunity than the others that I've mentioned. Moving on to Juwan Johnson. Juwan Johnson will take on the Seattle Seahawks. Just want to mention this. Of course, besides the fact that TJ Hawkinson went for 8 catches, 179 and 2 touchdowns. Kyle Pitts the week before, 5 catches, 87 yards. Will Dissly the week before, 38 receiving yards and a touchdown. Albert Okwuegbunam, week 1, had himself 5 catches, 33 yards. The Seattle Seahawks have had a tough time stopping opposing tight ends. And that this is going to continue to be the case, and we're going to see Juwan Johnson be the primary tight end within this offense. Of course, we did see some glimpses of Taysom Hill, a couple glimpses of Adam Trotman. But if Juwan Johnson is going to be the primary, he could have himself a sneaky touchdown that makes him a top 12 candidate by the end of week 5. Moving on to the final option, it is Logan Thomas. He did get a fair target share. 6 targets, 5 catches, only 19 receiving yards. But as long as he is getting ample opportunity, that's all we care for. He played 74% of the snaps. They take on Tennessee this upcoming week. Could be a pretty decent matchup. We just saw Mo Alley-Cox have himself 6 catches, 2 receiving touchdowns, over 60 receiving yards against the Tennessee Titans defense. It's just a matter of whether or not Carson Wentz is comfortable behind his offensive line and can deliver the ball to Logan Thomas this upcoming week. Let's move on to the quarterback position, beginning with Jared Goff. Jared Goff has been unbelievable. Besides the fact that he had no St. Brown, Swift, or Chark, and has obviously had a couple offensive line missing all season long, he still finishes the number 1 overall quarterback in a 4-point per passing touchdown format this past weekend. Thus far this season, he has finished as the number 17, 7, 19, and 1 overall quarterback in those given weeks. Overall, he definitely deserves to be, rostered in your league, currently rostered only 52% of leagues, as potentially someone that you want to have on roster because you know your bye week is coming up in just a few weeks here, and you want to have another option that is playing well and could be someone that you can utilize within that given week. Moving on to Geno Smith, another one of these players who's coming off of a couple good weeks here. He finishes the number 7 overall quarterback in week 3 and finishes the number 2 overall quarterback in week 4. Who would have guessed that this matchup between these two teams would be such a high-scoring affair? But Geno Smith has looked relatively good this season. Coming off a week in which he had 320 passing yards on a 77% passing completion percentage, 2 passing touchdowns, 7 rushes for 49 rushing yards, and a rushing touchdown. Geno Smith looked better than a lot of quarterbacks on Sunday. But going forward, taking on the New Orleans Saints defense, it still could be a tougher matchup, but I'm not too worried about it. The receiving threats that surround this quarterback are relevant enough to elevate him to a pretty high fantasy level that may give us points and the ability to start him in a given matchup. Moving on to Matt Ryan, or number 3. We have heard information regarding Jonathan Taylor and his status. He should be able to play on Thursday. If he doesn't, I think that only helps Matt Ryan potentially because they're going to have to throw the ball that much more. But if Jonathan Taylor's relevant, he's there, he wants to get active and start really pounding the rock, that would be fine because the Denver Broncos defense, they couldn't even stop Josh Jacobs. So Jonathan Taylor, please be active and ready. I think Matt Ryan over the last 2 weeks has been fine. 2 passing touchdowns each of the last 2 weeks. Both of them 2 tight ends. Obviously, Michael Pittman Jr. managers, you're a little bit upset, but nonetheless, there's a lot of opportunity to be had here. Matt Ryan, 2 consecutive weeks of a 73 passing completion percentage. If we are on this trend of relatively accurate, getting the ball into the end zone, Matt Ryan's a relevant fantasy quarterback. No questions asked. Moving on to Ryan Tannehill. Ryan Tannehill has been pretty good himself. Outside of the singular week against the Buffalo Bills in week 2, he has always put up 2 touchdowns minimum in every single other game. If this streak continues to be the case, of course, he's going to have a lot of relevant fantasy value. He's coming off a week in which he had an 81% passing completion percentage, 17 of 21 passing, 17% rostered, and takes on the Washington Commanders this upcoming weekend, whose secondary has been giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers. I know Treylon Burks is going to be missing time, but as long as Derrick Henry's catching the ball out of this backfield, Robert Woods is there, there's a lot of value to be had with Ryan Tannehill. Moving on to our number 5 option, we have Jameis Winston. I know he missed this last week's London game, and Andy Dalton had to play in his stead, but if Jameis Winston is active and available for the Seattle Seahawks matchup, he took on the Seattle Seahawks last season. He had himself a relatively good game, but the fact that Jared Goff is coming off of a monster 378 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns, and 33.22 fantasy points, that gives me that much more confidence that Jameis Winston, if healthy, can step up and have himself an incredible game, whether it is with or without Michael Thomas. I think there's a lot of opportunity to be had here in the given matchup. Jameis Winston is our number 5. Moving on to our final option, it is Zach Wilson. Zach Wilson, even though his passing completion percentage wasn't great, he was 18 for 36, 50% down the middle, 252 passing yards, a passing touchdown, a couple of interceptions thrown. We'll talk about the potential for playing the Miami defense this upcoming week against the New York Jets, but Zach Wilson could have value. He's going to be mobile. He's going to want to run the ball. He's going to find value in that regard when the pocket collapses in itself. But Zach Wilson could have value. He could improve, and it's just a matter of time as to whether or not he kind of meets that level or relegates himself to being in that Justin Fields category of someone we cannot trust as a second-year quarterback. Let's move on to the kicker and defensive portion of today's episode to finish our weekly episode out in terms of waiver wires, beginning with Brett Maher. Brett Maher was one of those guys that, as the week progressed after that Monday Night Football game, we were like, yeah, we're all in on Brett Maher because this offense is going to continue to score and they continue to have a lot of opportunities to kick. In the last 3 games, he has scored 12, 12, and 16. He's rostered in 21% of leagues. If you have the ability to go ahead and pick him up, he's a kicker that I want on my roster, taking on the LA Rams this week. Moving on to Gano. In the last 3 consecutive weeks, 17, 15, and 10. Those numbers have been declining, but if in fact in London, we're going to see an opportunity for Daniel Jones to be in this offense, maybe not as efficient considering they're playing against Green Bay, there may be a lot of opportunities for some kicks. A kicker only rostered in 17% of leagues, putting up double-digit points. He's scoring more points than running backs on a weekly basis. You want to have him on roster. Moving on to the final kicker I wanted to mention, it is Jason Sanders. Considering the fact that they take on the New York Jets, that in itself gives me confidence that this kicker that is only rostered in 8% of leagues, coming off of a 10-point fantasy performance against the Cincinnati Bengals, they're going to be a far less efficient offense with Teddy Bridgewater. And because of that being the case, they're going to have to kick even more. And considering it's a good matchup, they will be in plus field position for a majority of the game on the opposite side of the field in the New York Jets territory. And if that's going to be the case, a lot of kicks could be put up. And if that's going to go in, Jason Sanders could be a double-digit kicker for this given week. Moving on to team defenses, let's begin with the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Jacksonville Jaguars in the last 3 weeks, just last 4 weeks, have scored 6 points, 21 points, 9 points, and then additionally 9 points this last week against the Eagles. They take on the Houston Texans. It's a favorable matchup. Davis Mills will turn over the ball, and it's a defense that's only rostered in 13% of leagues. This team as a whole has transformed. And finally, for the first time in a while, I would say since 2017, we're considering starting the Jacksonville Jaguars defense. Moving on to Miami Dolphins, taking on the New York Jets. Like I mentioned a little bit ago, Zach Wilson's going to turn over the ball. It is just going to happen. And if the Miami Dolphins defense is going to have to carry this team for the weeks ahead until Tua's return, if in fact he does return, there's a lot of value to be had here. The Miami Dolphins defense only rostered in 22% of leagues, a pretty good opportunity here. The final defense I wanted to mention was the Tennessee Titans, mainly because Carson Wentz has shown that if in fact he is pressured, he is not going to find any success at all on Sundays. The last 2 weeks, he's taken on the Philadelphia Eagles and Dallas Cowboys, both teams that had great pass rushes that got in his face. And there's a reason why Carson Wentz right now is the most sacked quarterback in the NFL outside of Joe Burrow. So the Tennessee Titans, they've got a relatively good defensive line. That pass rush is going to be sent after them. And if Carson Wentz cannot get the job done early, there's going to be a conversation here where the pass rush gets to him, forces turnovers, and gets themselves a pretty good sample of fantasy points. All right, that's going to go ahead and cover it for today. That is our waiver wire targets for week 5 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you like today's video and the content, be sure to click the like button down below. Of course, subscribe to the channel if you have not yet already. We are very close to reaching our goal of 70,000 subscribers. Of course, we're going to get to 69,000. Nice. We're going to get to 70,000. And once we surpass that, we're not stopping anytime soon, making daily content in order to help you out. So be sure to let me know down in the comment section, are there any players that I didn't mention today that deserve to potentially be picked up as a waiver option? We'll talk about that as a community down in the comment section. But outside of that, tomorrow we're going to be talking about the running back position, our top 36 rankings. And until then, enjoy tonight's game. Let's hope Cooper Kupp scores a lot of points for us. And until next time, guys, I'll see you. Peace.